Have you ever wondered what it felt like to wake up and realize your body, your hands, your sweat, your very breath belonged to someone else? Not for a lifetime, mind you, for a day. Just one single sunrise to sunset, and then the same nightmare would begin again with a different master, a different whip, a different set of eyes measuring your worth like cattle at auction. Today, I want to take you somewhere most history books have forgotten. A place that sits across the Mississippi River from the city everyone thinks they know. A place called Algiers. And I promise you, what you are about to hear will change everything you thought you understood about American slavery. This is not about chains and plantations in some distant abstraction. This is about contracts, about paper, about signatures that turned human beings into rental property, exchanged between neighbors like farming equipment, and one of those contracts survived. It made its way through 2 centuries of floods, fires, and willful forgetting. It sits now in an archive, yellowed and brittle, bearing witness to something we were never supposed to remember. If you believe that truth deserves to be told, if you believe that forgotten voices deserve to be heard, then stay with me. Press that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to pull you into a world that will haunt you long after the last word fades away. The morning mist still clings to the mudflats where Algiers Point meets the Mississippi, thick and gray like a shroud that refuses to lift. Spanish moss hangs from the cypress trees in funeral curtains, dripping moisture onto soil that has absorbed more tears than rainfall over 3 generations of human bondage. The old powder magazine, that squat brick building erected by frightened colonists who feared the very people they enslaved, still stands as a monument to terror. Its walls were built thick enough to contain explosives, thick enough to serve as a final refuge should the hundreds of black bodies warehoused across the river rise up in righteous fury. But the powder was never lit. The explosion never came. Instead, something quieter happened here. Something that history has largely chosen to forget. In 1799, in the waning years of Spanish colonial rule, Algiers operated as one of the most sophisticated human rental markets in the Americas, not merely a place where enslaved people were bought and sold in the traditional sense, but a place where they were leased by the day, by the week, by the task, where a man or woman might wake up belonging to one master and fall asleep under the authority of another, where children learned to recognize the faces of a dozen different overseers before they turned 10 years old. The story begins with a single piece of paper, dated November 14, 1799, that documents the daily rental of an enslaved woman named Celestine. And in the margins of that contract, in the spaces between the legal language of ownership and the cold calculus of profit, lies a testament to resistance that the authors never intended to preserve. Stand on Algiers Point today, and you will see the New Orleans skyline glittering across the water, a city of jazz and tourism, and carefully curated nostalgia. But if you know where to look, if you understand what the ground beneath your feet has witnessed, the glitter fades and something else emerges. The outline of cabins that once stood in neat rows behind the great house. The path that led from the levee to the auction block. The iron rings long since removed, where human beings were chained while waiting to learn who would possess them next. This land remembers what we have chosen to forget. And it is time we listened. If you want to accompany more cases like this one, cases that shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew and reveal truths hidden for centuries, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss a single investigation. The company plantation, as it was known during the French era, sprawled across what is now Algiers Point like a wound in the earth. By 1799, under Spanish administration, it had transformed into something even more mechanized, more efficient in its cruelty. The main compound stretched nearly 300 feet along the riverbank, comprising the great house with its wide galleries facing east to catch the morning breeze, the overseer quarters, the storage buildings for tools and provisions, the small infirmary where sick enslaved workers were treated just enough to return them to productive labor, and of course the cabins. 34 cabins, each measuring 24 feet by 13 feet, arranged in neat rows behind the main house like the cells of a honeycomb. Each cabin held between 4 and 8 human beings, depending on the season and the current demand for rental workers. The mathematics of human density was calculated with the same precision applied to stacking barrels of sugar in a ship's hold. Every square foot had its economic justification. The hierarchy of this world was absolute and Byzantine in its complexity. At the apex sat the Spanish colonial administrator, a man named Don Sebastián Bautista de Almonte, who had purchased the property from the bankrupt Company of the Indies through a series of intermediary transactions designed to obscure the true nature of his wealth. Beneath him came the commandant, a Frenchman named Pierre Duvernay who had adapted seamlessly to Spanish rule, finding that the language of profit translated perfectly across colonial boundaries. Then, the overseers, 3 of them, each responsible for a different aspect of operations. Jacques Menil supervised the field workers who cultivated indigo and rice on the plantation's own acreage. Thomas Greer, an American from Virginia who had drifted south following debts and darker troubles, managed the rental operations, maintaining the ledgers that tracked which enslaved person was leased to which client for which tasks at which rate. And finally, Baptiste, a free man of color whose official title was interpreter, but whose actual function was to serve as intermediary between the white administrative structure and the enslaved population, translating not merely words, but intentions, warnings, and the subtle calibrations of power that determined who lived comfortably and who suffered. The daily rhythm of Algiers began before dawn, when the first bell rang at 4:30 in the morning during summer months, 5 o'clock in winter. The enslaved workers rose from their pallets of Spanish moss and cotton rags, splashed water on their faces from the communal troughs, and assembled in the yard between the cabins for the morning count. This count served multiple purposes. It verified that no one had escaped during the night. It allowed the overseers to assess the physical condition of each worker, identifying those too sick to labor, and those who might be feigning illness. And most importantly for the rental system, it established the available inventory for the day's transactions. By 6 o'clock, the first clients would begin arriving at the main house to negotiate their rentals. A sugar planter from across the river might need 5 strong men to help with the harvest crush. A merchant in the French Quarter might require a skilled cooper to repair barrels. A widow might seek a domestic servant for a dinner party she was hosting that evening. The rates varied according to skill, physical condition, season, and the urgency of the client's needs. A common field hand might rent for 50 cents per day. A skilled blacksmith could command $2. A woman trained in domestic service fell somewhere in between, her value fluctuating based on factors that the ledgers recorded in coded abbreviations that modern historians have struggled to decipher. The sounds that defined Algiers were unmistakable and inescapable. The creak of oars as flatboats ferried enslaved workers across the river to their temporary masters. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer from the forge near the levee, where repairs were made to the chains and shackles that the system required. The low murmur of voices in the cabins at night, conversations held in whispers because certain words carried death sentences if overheard. The splash of the Mississippi against the wooden pilings, a sound that enslaved people learned to associate with either hope or despair, depending on the direction of travel. And underlying everything, the constant scratch of quill on paper as Thomas Greer recorded his transactions in the great leather-bound ledger that would eventually be seized by American authorities following the Louisiana Purchase, and subsequently lost, destroyed, or hidden away in private collections, where uncomfortable truths could be safely forgotten. Celestine first appears in the surviving records on March 12, 1799, though fragments of earlier documents suggest she had been present at Algiers for at least 3 years prior. The contract describes her as a mulatresse of approximately 26 years, skilled in domestic service, needlework, and the preparation of medicinal compounds. These skills placed her in an unusual position within the plantation hierarchy. She was too valuable to be assigned to field work, too educated to be easily controlled through the usual mechanisms of violence and deprivation, and too essential to the rental operation's profitability to be sold away to some distant master. Her knowledge of herbs and healing made her indispensable when workers fell ill or were injured. Her ability to read and write, likely acquired through some earlier owner who had violated the colonial laws against educating enslaved people, made her useful as an unofficial recorder of information that the overseers preferred not to commit to official documents, and her position as a domestic servant who moved between the great house and the cabins gave her access to both worlds, hearing conversations that masters assumed were private, observing the mechanics of power from angles that few enslaved people ever witnessed. The paradox of Celestine's existence lay in the very skills that made her valuable. She could read the contracts that governed her own rental. She understood the legal terminology that reduced her humanity to a series of economic transactions. She could calculate the profits that her labor generated and compare them to the pittance that was spent on her maintenance. This knowledge was both a weapon and a wound. It allowed her to navigate the system with a sophistication that her masters never fully appreciated, but it also forced her to confront, every day, the precise dimensions of her own degradation. Most enslaved people in Algiers experienced their bondage as an overwhelming force, something as natural and immutable as the river itself. Celestine experienced it as a construction, a human artifact that had been deliberately built and could therefore, at least theoretically, be dismantled. She moved between the plantation and the city, with a freedom that made other enslaved people both envious and suspicious. When Don Sebastian needed medicines compounded for his persistent gout, Celestine traveled to the apothecary on Chartres Street unaccompanied, carrying a pass that authorized her presence in the French Quarter. When Madame Duvernay, the overseer's wife, required assistance with a particularly complex embroidery project, Celestine spent weeks at a time in the main house, sleeping on a pallet in the sewing room rather than returning to the cabins. These privileges came with their own costs. Other enslaved people sometimes viewed her as a collaborator, someone who had traded solidarity for comfort. The masters viewed her as a particularly refined piece of property, a possession whose value lay precisely in her cultivation, her education, her veneer of civilization that made her acceptable company in spaces where ordinary field hands would never be permitted. Celestine learned to exist in the space between these perceptions, belonging fully to neither world, trusted completely by no one. But she watched, and she remembered, and she waited. Leave a comment below saying, "Never give up on truth," if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. The spring of 1799 brought changes that would prove decisive for everything that followed. The yellow fever epidemic that swept through New Orleans between April and October killed an estimated 8% of the city's population and disrupted every aspect of colonial commerce. The wealthy fled to their country estates, the poor died in their hovels, and the enslaved people of Algiers found themselves suddenly more valuable than ever, their labor in demand for the grim tasks of caring for the sick, burying the dead, and maintaining the essential functions of a society in crisis. The rental rates doubled, then tripled. Thomas Greer worked through the night recording transactions, his ledger filling with entries that documented the exploitation of catastrophe. And the enslaved workers themselves experienced something unprecedented. For the first time, demand exceeded supply so dramatically that masters could not simply replace workers who collapsed from exhaustion or fell ill themselves. The usual calculus of disposability shifted, ever so slightly, toward preservation. But this shift came with its own horrors. Celestine was rented to the Ursuline convent in August, tasked with preparing the herbal remedies that the nuns administered to fever victims in their makeshift hospital. She spent 17 consecutive days there, sleeping in 2-hour intervals on a cot beside the medicine chest, watching people die in numbers that exceeded her ability to count. The nuns worked alongside her with a dedication that transcended the usual boundaries of race and status, united in the desperate effort to stem a tide that seemed unstoppable. Sister Marie-Thérèse, an elderly nun who had survived 3 previous epidemics, taught Celestine additional techniques for compounding medicines, sharing knowledge that would have been forbidden under normal circumstances. In those fever-haunted weeks, something shifted in Celestine's understanding of what was possible. She saw white women exhausting themselves in service to black patients. She saw the rigid hierarchies of colonial society temporarily suspended by the democracy of disease, and she began to imagine, perhaps for the first time, a world organized according to different principles. The epidemic also revealed the rental system's most brutal aspects. When enslaved workers fell ill while serving temporary masters, disputes arose over responsibility. Who should pay for their medical care? Who bore the economic loss if they died? The contracts, drafted during healthier times, provided no clear answers. Don Sebastian found himself embroiled in a lawsuit against a merchant named Etienne Labattu, who had rented 3 enslaved men in June and returned only 2 in September, claiming that the third had died of fever and that the death was an act of God for which he bore no financial liability. The case wound through the Spanish colonial courts for months, generating documents that inadvertently preserved details about the rental system that might otherwise have been lost. In the end, Labatut was ordered to pay half the assessed value of the deceased man, a compromise that satisfied neither party but established a precedent that would govern similar disputes for the remaining years of Spanish rule. The deceased man's name was Solomon. He was 34 years old. He had a wife named Ruth and 2 children he would never see again. His value, according to the court's assessment, was 420 Spanish dollars. Half of that, $210, was the price of his entire existence, payable in 3 installments over 6 months. The documents record the payment schedule in meticulous detail. They do not record Ruth's grief, or the children's tears, or the empty space in a cabin where Solomon's voice would never be heard again. The violence that the epidemic had temporarily suspended returned with renewed intensity once the fever season passed. The masters, having survived the summer's terror, reasserted their authority with particular viciousness. A young man named Jean-Baptiste, who had been rented to a sugar plantation during the epidemic and had run away when his temporary master attempted to work him to death, was captured in November and returned to Algiers for punishment. The punishment was public and prolonged, designed to remind the entire enslaved population of the consequences of resistance. Jean-Baptiste received 50 lashes over 3 consecutive days, the wounds left untreated between sessions so that each new stroke would tear open barely healed flesh. Celestine was ordered to tend his wounds afterward, applying the same herbal poultices she had used to treat fever victims. As she worked on his torn back, Jean-Baptiste whispered to her about what he had seen during his weeks of freedom. The maroon communities in the swamps east of the city, the networks of free black sailors who sometimes helped runaways escape to Haiti or Mexico. The quiet resistance that persisted despite every punishment the system could devise. These whispers planted seeds that would germinate over the months that followed. But the true wound that year, the one that would never heal, came closer to home. Celestine had a mother. Her name was Margot, and she had been sold away from Algiers 12 years earlier, when Celestine was 14 years old. The separation had been sudden and brutal, as such separations always were. One morning Margot was there, braiding Celestine's hair before dawn. By evening she was gone, sold to a planter from Natchez who had paid cash and loaded his new property onto a flatboat before the sun set. Celestine had not seen her mother since, had not known whether she was alive or dead, had carried that uncertainty like a stone in her chest for 12 years, the weight of it so familiar she sometimes forgot it was there. In October of 1799, a letter arrived at Algiers. It was addressed to the estate of Don Sebastian de Almonte, and it concerned a legal matter related to a deceased enslaved woman named Margot. The letter requested documentation of Margot's original sale, as her current owner was attempting to settle various debts associated with her estate. The letter was not meant for Celestine. She should never have seen it. But she was cleaning Don Sebastian's study when the mail arrived, and the name caught her eye before she could look away. Margot was dead, had been dead for 3 years, had died giving birth to a child who also died, had been buried in an unmarked grave on a plantation that Celestine could not locate on any map. 3 years. For 3 years, Celestine had been sending prayers to a woman who no longer existed, had been hoping for a reunion that could never happen, had been carrying a stone that had transformed, without her knowledge, from uncertainty to fact. She did not cry. She could not afford to cry, not in Don Sebastian's study, not where anyone might see. She placed the letter back on the desk, finished dusting the shelves, and returned to her duties with a face that betrayed nothing. That night, alone in the cabin she shared with 3 other women, she allowed herself to feel what she had been holding at bay all day. The grief came in waves that threatened to drown her. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. A cold clarity that had not been there before. A resolve that hardened with each passing hour. The system that had stolen her mother was not a force of nature. It was a human construction, maintained by human choices, dependent on human complicity. And human constructions could be challenged, could be undermined, could eventually be destroyed. Celestine did not sleep that night. She lay in the darkness, listening to the breathing of the women around her, and made a promise to herself that she intended to keep. The antagonism that Celestine faced operated on multiple levels simultaneously, a layered structure of opposition that made resistance seem impossible from any angle. Don Sebastián de Almonte represented the highest level, a man whose cruelty was largely administrative, exercised through ledgers and contracts rather than whips and chains. He rarely visited Algiers in person, preferring to manage his investments from a comfortable townhouse in the Vieux Carré, where he could maintain the fiction that his wealth derived from abstract commercial activities rather than the daily degradation of human beings. His cruelty was the cruelty of calculation, of reducing people to numbers, of treating suffering as an externality that did not appear in his carefully balanced accounts. He signed orders for punishments he would never witness. He approved sales that separated families he would never see. He collected profits that were watered with blood he would never have to wash from his own hands. Pierre Duvernay, the commandant, represented something different, a man who had lived among enslaved people his entire career, who had learned to enjoy the petty exercises of power that his position afforded, who had developed over the years a philosophy that justified his actions as necessary discipline, essential to the maintenance of order in a world that would descend into chaos without the firm hand of white authority. His cruelty was intimate and deliberate, calibrated to inflict maximum terror with minimum permanent damage, since permanently damaged workers reduced profitability. He knew the names of the people he punished. He remembered their faces. He took pleasure in breaking spirits that had shown too much independence, in crushing hopes that had dared to rise above the acceptable level. Thomas Greer occupied yet another level in this architecture of antagonism, an American who had found in the slave system a path to respectability that his humble origins and checkered past would never have permitted. In Virginia, Greer brought to his work the particular enthusiasm of the convert. He kept his ledgers with obsessive precision, recording every transaction in a hand so neat it seemed mechanical. He developed systems for categorizing enslaved workers according to their skills, their health, their temperament, their susceptibility to various forms of control. He prided himself on his ability to assess a worker's value at a glance, to predict which clients would pay on time and which would require collection efforts. And he had developed over the years a particular interest in workers like Celestine, workers whose intelligence and education made them potentially valuable and potentially dangerous. He watched her the way a hunter watches prey, with patience and attention, waiting for the mistake that would justify intervention. The catalyst that transformed simmering tensions into open crisis arrived in February 1800, though its origins lay in events that had occurred years earlier and thousands of miles away. News reached New Orleans that France had reacquired Louisiana from Spain through the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso. The Spanish administration would continue temporarily, but everyone understood that fundamental changes were coming. For the enslaved population, the news carried complex implications. The French colonial system had been, in some ways, even more brutal than the Spanish. But France itself was convulsed by revolution, and the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity had already sparked the great uprising in Saint-Domingue that would soon create the independent nation of Haiti. If France took direct control of Louisiana, might those ideals cross the ocean as well? The enslaved people of Algiers debated these questions in whispered conversations, parsing rumors that arrived with every ship from the Caribbean, trying to discern what the political upheavals of distant empires might mean for their own hopes of freedom. The confrontation occurred on the morning of April 3, 1800. Thomas Greer had been watching Celestine for weeks, noting her absences, intercepting fragments of communication that suggested she was involved in something unauthorized. When he found a letter hidden in the medicine chest, a letter written in a hand that was not Celestine's, and containing information about shipping schedules and safe houses, he believed he finally had the evidence he needed. He brought Celestine before Pierre Duvernay and Don Sebastian, who had traveled to Algiers specifically to address what Greer described as a conspiracy of potentially catastrophic proportions. The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Celestine admitted nothing. She denied knowing who had placed the letter in the medicine chest. She denied any involvement with networks of resistance. She maintained her composure with a stillness that infuriated her questioners, answering their shouts with silence, their threats with calm statements that she had committed no offense and expected to be treated accordingly. The punishment that followed was designed not merely to cause pain, but to break something essential in Celestine's spirit. She was stripped and tied to the post in the yard between the cabins, where every enslaved person at Algiers could witness her degradation. Don Sebastian himself pronounced the sentence: 25 lashes for the offense of possessing unauthorized correspondence, 50 additional lashes, to be administered over 2 subsequent days, for the offense of insolence during interrogation, and revocation of all privileges that had previously permitted her to move relatively freely between the plantation and the city. She would be confined to the cabins when not actively working. She would be assigned to field labor rather than domestic service. She would be stripped of the skills and education that had made her valuable, reduced to the common condition of enslaved labor from which she had previously been partially exempt. The sentence was calculated to destroy everything she had been, to demonstrate to the entire enslaved community that there was no position so privileged, no person so protected, that the system could not annihilate them utterly if they stepped beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior. What the masters did not understand, could not have understood, was that Celestine had been preparing for this moment. The network she had contacted had anticipated that she might be discovered. They had provided her with information about how to survive punishment without breaking, how to endure pain by focusing the mind on images of freedom, how to maintain inner resistance even while the body submitted to external force. As the lash fell on her back again and again, Celestine fixed her gaze on a point beyond the yard, beyond the plantation, beyond the river. She watched clouds drifting across the spring sky. She counted the strokes not as units of suffering, but as steps towards something she had already decided. By the time the punishment was complete, her back was a ruin of torn flesh. But something in her eyes remained unbroken. Pierre Duvernay noticed it. He mentioned it to Thomas Greer afterward, troubled by what he had seen. There should have been despair in those eyes. There should have been submission. Instead, there had been something else entirely, something that looked, impossibly, like triumph. The weeks that followed Celestine's punishment became the crucible in which a plan took final shape. She was assigned to the rice fields, work that was backbreaking and monotonous, performed standing in water that bred mosquitoes and harbored water moccasins. But the fields offered one advantage that domestic service had never provided. They allowed her to work alongside other enslaved people, to speak with them in the rhythm of labor, to share information in fragments that could be pieced together over days and weeks into a coherent whole. She discovered that she was not alone in her resistance, that others at Algiers had been nursing their own plans, their own connections, their own hopes of escape. The network that had contacted her had contacts among the enslaved population as well, people who had been watching her, assessing her, waiting to see how she would respond to adversity before trusting her with their own secrets. The plan that emerged from these whispered conversations was not a plan for violent uprising. The lessons of the failed Pointe-Coupée conspiracies in 1791 and 1795 had been thoroughly learned. Mass rebellion resulted in mass execution, in severed heads displayed along the river road, in reprisals that fell on the innocent as well as the guilty. Instead, The plan focused on escape, on creating a permanent route by which enslaved people could flee to freedom in territories beyond the reach of American or European slave law. The Spanish system of coartación, which allowed enslaved people to purchase their own freedom at assessed prices, would provide legal cover for some. The maroon communities in the swamps would provide refuge for others. And the ships that sailed from New Orleans to Cuba, to Mexico, to the Caribbean, would provide transport for those who could reach them. Celestine's role would be crucial. Her skills with medicine would allow her to treat injuries and illnesses that might otherwise prevent escape. Her ability to read and write would allow her to forge the passes and documents that free movement required. And her knowledge of the rental system would allow her to identify moments of vulnerability, gaps in surveillance, opportunities for flight. The Confederates assembled slowly, carefully, over months of observation and testing. There was Marcus, a blacksmith, whose skills made him valuable enough that his temporary masters often permitted him unusual freedoms. There was Suzanne, an elderly woman who worked in the plantation kitchen and who had, over decades, developed the ability to move about seemingly invisible to the white people around her. There was Gabriel, a young man who had been born in Saint-Domingue and who carried in his memory the tactics and traditions of the Haitian Revolution. And there were others, perhaps a dozen in all, each contributing specific skills or connections to the whole. They communicated through a system of signals and codes that had been developed over generations of enslaved resistance. A certain pattern of knots in a rope, a specific arrangement of objects on a shelf, words with double meanings that could be spoken openly without arousing suspicion. The system was imperfect. There were always risks of discovery, but it had survived for decades, and it would survive a while longer. The date chosen for the first major escape was significant. June 24, 1800, the Feast of St. John the Baptist, a day when the enslaved population was traditionally permitted certain liberties. Drumming and dancing were allowed in Congo Square. Some masters granted their workers small indulgences, a measure of rum or a few hours of rest. The festivities would provide cover for movement, for gatherings that might otherwise attract attention. And the timing coincided with the departure of a ship called the Santa Maria del Carmen, bound for Veracruz with a captain who had been persuaded, through a combination of bribery and ideological sympathy, to carry passengers who would not appear on any official manifest. The plan was not to empty Algiers, that would be impossible, but it might free a dozen people, and those dozen, once established in freedom, could help others. The network would grow. The routes would become more reliable. The system, which seemed so permanent and immutable, would be eroded one escape at a time. The night of June 23rd passed in a fever of preparation that had to remain invisible to watching eyes. In the great house, Pierre Duvernay and his wife hosted a dinner for neighboring planters, celebrating the festival in the traditional manner with roast pork, imported wine, and conversation that touched on the political uncertainties that troubled everyone's sleep. The French were coming, but when? And what would their coming mean? Would the new regime honor existing property rights? Would the revolutionary ideals that had already upended Saint-Domingue find purchase in Louisiana as well? The planters drank and argued and reassured each other that whatever changes came, the fundamental order of things would remain undisturbed. The enslaved people who served their dinner, bringing dishes and pouring wine, listened without appearing to listen, storing away fragments of information that might prove useful. In the cabins, a different kind of preparation was underway. Celestine had gathered the medicines that might be needed, poultices for wounds that might be suffered during the escape, herbs that could reduce fever or ease pain, a small quantity of laudanum, stolen from the plantation infirmary over weeks of careful pilfering, that could be used to quiet a crying child or ease the suffering of someone too injured to continue. Marcus had fashioned tools from scraps of metal, tools that could cut through rope or force a lock if necessary. Suzanne had assembled food, dried meat and hard bread that would sustain travelers for days without fire or fresh provisions. And Gabriel had memorized the route, every twist of the bayou, every landmark that would guide them through the swamps to the rendezvous point where boats would be waiting. The signal was to be a song, not a song that anyone would recognize as a signal. A work song, the kind that enslaved people sang every day while laboring in the fields. But this particular song, sung at this particular time, would carry a message to those who knew how to hear it. When the third verse was sung, it meant that the time had come. Those who were leaving would make their way to the edge of the plantation, where the cultivated fields gave way to the cypress swamp. They would move in darkness, without torches, trusting the moon that would rise late that night to light their way once they were safely beyond surveillance. And if everything went according to plan, they would be on the water before dawn, invisible among the traffic of boats that moved constantly along the bayous of southern Louisiana. But even as the conspirators made their final preparations, forces were moving against them that they did not fully understand. Thomas Greer had been watching. He had noticed changes in behavior among certain enslaved people, patterns of movement that deviated from established routines. He did not know the specifics of what was being planned, but he sensed that something was approaching, some event that would require his intervention. That night, while the planters drank and the enslaved prepared, Greer sat in his office reviewing the ledgers. He made a list of names, workers whose behavior had given him concern. Celestine's name was at the top of that list. He decided that he would speak to Pierre Duvernay in the morning, would recommend increased surveillance, would suggest that certain privileges be further curtailed. He did not know that by morning, everything would have changed. The Feast of St. John began with drumming at dawn. The enslaved population of Algiers assembled in the yard for the morning count as usual, but there was an electricity in the air that the overseers could feel without being able to name. The festival created a controlled space for celebration, a valve through which pressures could be released before they built to dangerous levels. The masters believed they understood this mechanism. They believed they controlled it. They were wrong. The morning passed in apparent normalcy. Workers were assigned to reduce duties in honor of the festival. Small gifts of food and rum were distributed. The overseers maintained their vigilance but with a relaxed posture that acknowledged the special nature of the day. At midday, the first of the escapees began to move. They did not move together. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they drifted away in ones and twos, each following a slightly different route, each timing their departure to coincide with moments of distraction. A celebration in one quarter of the compound drew attention away from movement in another. The overseers, watching for groups, failed to notice individuals. Celestine was among the last to leave. Her role required her to remain visible for as long as possible, to deflect suspicion, to provide alibis for those who had already gone. She moved through the compound with the ease of long practice, speaking to people, being seen, establishing the impression that everything was normal. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she walked toward the latrines at the edge of the plantation and did not return. The alarm was not raised until evening, when the overseers finally conducted a count and discovered that 14 people were missing. By then, the escapees had a 4-hour head start. They were deep in the swamps, following the route that Gabriel had memorized, moving toward the rendezvous point where freedom waited. Pierre Duvernay organized a pursuit immediately. He sent riders to alert neighboring plantations. He dispatched boats along the bayous. He promised rewards for information and punishments for anyone who might have helped the escapees. But the swamps were vast and trackless, and night was falling, and the pursuers did not know where to look. For the first time in her life, Celestine tasted freedom. It was not a metaphor. It was a physical sensation, a lightness in her chest, a clarity in her vision that she had never experienced before. The water of the bayou lapped against the boat that carried her. The stars emerged above the cypress trees. And somewhere ahead, invisible in the darkness, lay a ship that would carry her beyond the reach of everyone who had ever claimed to own her. Not everyone made it. 2 of the escapees were captured the following day, betrayed by a free person of color, who feared the reprisals that might fall on his community if he remained silent. They were returned to Algiers and punished with a severity that was meant to discourage anyone who might consider similar attempts. But 12 people reached the Santa Maria del Carmen. 12 people sailed from Louisiana waters to the coast of Mexico. 12 people stepped onto foreign soil as free individuals. Their bondage ended not by the grace of masters, but by their own courage and determination. Celestine was among them. The ship anchored in Veracruz harbor on July 18, 1800. The captain, true to his word, landed his unauthorized passengers at night on a beach outside the city where no customs officials would ask uncomfortable questions. He provided them with letters of introduction to contacts in the local community, people who could help them establish new lives in a country where slavery existed, but where the system's grip was looser, where opportunities for freedom were more numerous. Celestine stood on Mexican soil as the sun rose over the Gulf. Behind her lay everything she had known, the plantation, the cabins, the endless cycle of rental and return. Before her lay uncertainty, danger, the challenge of building a life from nothing in a land whose language she barely spoke and whose customs she did not understand. But she was free. The word meant something different now than it had before. It was not an abstraction, a concept discussed in whispered conversations. It was the absence of the bell that had woken her every morning for as long as she could remember. It was the right to decide where she would go and what she would do. It was the knowledge that no one could sell her, rent her, punish her for imaginary offenses. The other escapees dispersed to various destinations. Some remained in Veracruz, finding work in the port's thriving economy. Some traveled inland to Mexico City, seeking opportunities in the capital. Some eventually made their way to Haiti, the Black Republic that had been born from revolution and that welcomed refugees from slavery throughout the Americas. Celestine remained in Veracruz for 2 years, working as a healer, using the skills she had learned at Algiers and at the Ursuline convent to treat the illnesses that afflicted the city's poor. She learned Spanish, adapted to local customs, built relationships with the community of free Black people who had established themselves in the city over generations. And she did not forget those she had left behind. Through networks that stretched across the Gulf of Mexico, she maintained contact with the resistance movement in Louisiana. She provided information about routes and safe havens. She helped coordinate subsequent escapes, each one building on the knowledge gained from previous attempts. The system she had helped to create outlived the colonial era. When the United States took possession of Louisiana in 1803, the underground networks continued to operate, adapting to new circumstances, finding new routes, helping new generations of enslaved people reach freedom. The contract that had authorized her rental, dated November 14, 1799, survived by accident. It was among a bundle of documents seized by American authorities during the transition of power, and subsequently deposited in an archive where it lay unexamined for nearly 2 centuries. When historians finally rediscovered it in the 1990s, they found something extraordinary. In the margin, in a hand that was not Thomas Greer's, someone had written a single word in French: libre, free. The escape from Algiers in June 1800 sent shockwaves through the slaveholding community of Louisiana. The planters gathered in emergency meetings, debating how such a thing could have happened, who was to blame, what measures could prevent similar occurrences in the future. Thomas Greer was dismissed from his position, his careful ledgers having failed to predict or prevent the catastrophe. Pierre Duvernay resigned his commandancy, his reputation ruined by the escape that had occurred on his watch. But the system itself survived. New overseers were hired, new security measures implemented, new punishments devised for any enslaved person suspected of harboring thoughts of flight. The rental operations continued, the ledgers filled with new entries, the profits flowed into the accounts of owners who convinced themselves that the escape had been an anomaly, a one-time failure that would not be repeated. They were wrong again. In the years that followed, a steady trickle of enslaved people disappeared from Algiers and other Louisiana plantations. Some were captured and returned. Some died in the swamps, victims of exposure or snakebite or the bullets of pursuers. But some reached freedom, guided by networks that grew more sophisticated with each passing year. The routes that Celestine and her Confederates had pioneered became part of a larger system that historians would later call the Underground Railroad, though that name came much later and applied primarily to the northern routes that carried escaped slaves to Canada. The southern routes, the ones that led to Mexico and the Caribbean, remained less well documented, their records scattered or destroyed, their heroes largely unknown. But they existed. They saved lives. They proved that resistance was possible even in the most oppressive circumstances. The rental system itself underwent changes in the early 19th century. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 brought American legal traditions into conflict with Spanish and French practices. The specific mechanisms of daily rental evolved, became more formalized in some ways, more informal in others. But the fundamental principle remained the same. Human beings were property. Property could be bought, sold, or rented. The contracts that documented these transactions were legal instruments, enforceable in courts of law, backed by the full power of the state. This principle would not be challenged successfully until the Civil War, more than 60 years after Celestine's escape. And even then, the end of legal slavery would not mean the end of the systems that had made it possible, the attitudes and institutions that had treated some human beings as less than fully human. Those systems persist, in modified forms, to this day. The Spanish colonial authorities did not accept the loss of their property quietly. Don Sebastián de Almonte filed legal claims in multiple jurisdictions, seeking the return of the escapees or compensation for their value. His lawyers argued that the Mexican authorities had an obligation under international law to return fugitive slaves to their rightful owners. The case dragged through diplomatic channels for years, complicated by the political chaos that followed the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican independence movement that began in 1810. In the end, no one was returned. The escapees had vanished into the populations of their new countries, their identities obscured, their locations unknown. Don Sebastián eventually wrote off his losses and turned his attention to other investments. But the case established precedents that would shape debates about slavery and international law for decades to come. What obligations did one nation have to return fugitives to another? Did the principle of property rights extend across national borders? Could a person be simultaneously free in one jurisdiction and enslaved in another? These questions would be argued in courts and legislatures throughout the 19th century, culminating in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Dred Scott decision of 1857, decisions that would help precipitate the Civil War that finally ended American slavery. Celestine did not live to see that war. She died in Veracruz in 1834, at approximately 61 years of age, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known slavery. The community she had helped to build mourned her passing, honoring her memory with the rituals that free Black people had developed over generations of resistance. She was buried in a cemetery overlooking the Gulf of Mexico, the waters that had carried her to freedom more than 3 decades earlier. Her grave marker, if it ever existed, has long since disappeared, eroded by time and weather and the general forgetfulness that claims most human memories. But the network she helped to create survived her. It continued to operate through the Mexican-American War, through the Civil War, through the decades of Reconstruction and reaction that followed. It evolved and adapted, taking new forms as circumstances changed, but always serving the same fundamental purpose: helping people escape bondage, guiding them toward freedom, proving that the system, however powerful it seemed, was not invincible. The contract, dated November 14, 1799, now rests in a climate-controlled archive in Louisiana. It is a fragile document, the paper yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. It records a routine commercial transaction, the rental of an enslaved woman named Celestine to a planter named Antoine Mercier, for a period not to exceed 30 days at a rate of 75 cents per day. The contract says nothing about Celestine's intelligence, her education, her determination. It says nothing about the network she would join, the escape she would help organize, the freedom she would achieve. It is a document of commerce, not of humanity. It reduces a person to a price, And yet, in the margin, in that single word written in a different hand, the document transcends its original purpose. Libre. Someone who knew what had happened wanted to ensure that the record would be corrected, that future generations, if they ever found this contract, would know that the transaction it documented did not define the person it described, that Celestine had become something more than property, that she had claimed the freedom that was her birthright. We do not know who wrote that word. Perhaps it was someone who remained at Algiers after the escape, a Confederate who stayed behind to continue the work that Celestine had helped to begin. Perhaps it was a clerk in the archive, someone who came across the document years later and felt compelled to add their own commentary. Perhaps it was someone we will never be able to identify, their contribution to history limited to this single word in the margin of a forgotten contract. It does not matter. What matters is that the word is there, that the record has been amended, that the story does not end with a transaction, but with a transformation. Algiers Point today is a quiet neighborhood of New Orleans, gentrified and charming, popular with artists and young professionals who appreciate its views of the city skyline across the river. The cabins are gone. The great house is gone. The rental operation that once made this place notorious throughout the lower Mississippi Valley has left no visible trace, but the ground remembers, and now, so do you. If you watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying I watched until here, so I can know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if the story of Celestine touched your heart. Share so that the memory of Celestine and all the enslaved people of Algiers will never be forgotten.